Hello everyone, good afternoon and welcome to We Love History Live. I'm Kevin Grant, I'm an archaeologist at Historic Environment Scotland. So whilst we're all working from home in our home offices, back bedrooms, lounges, drawing rooms if you're posh, and all finding it a bit more difficult to get to the historic places we love, we're doing these live streams to give you some insight into what we're all doing, what we're up to and work that we're doing around Scotland's history and our historic environment. So it gives me enormous pleasure to introduce my close friend and colleague Simon, who is a senior casework officer at Historic Environment Scotland and does a lot of work around listed buildings. Say hello, Simon.
Hello.
So before we start, just to say this is a Q&A, so we're going out live on Facebook and YouTube. So we'd love to hear your questions and we'll take them live and can hopefully have a chat to all of you who are out there watching and listening. So if you ask your questions in Facebook or if you have a Google account on YouTube, we'll try and answer them as we go. And just give us those anytime. We're not going to try to take them as they come. So we'll look forward to seeing those questions. So if we're ready, I've got my cup of tea. We're going to discuss today some work that Simon has been doing around John O Groats Mill, which is an interesting building in the north of Scotland. So Simon, should we start off with John O Groats, for those who have not heard of it? Where is it? What is it?
Well, there's a famous picture coming up of a famous sign at John O Groats. And John O Groats is at the very top northeast corner of Scotland. So if we see the map coming next, that red triangle on the if we have any international listeners, that red triangle at the top right is Caithness, and John O Groats is the top right corner of that red triangle, and it's commonly credited with being the most northerly point in Scotland, although in fact most northerly point in Scotland is actually at Dunnet Head nearby. But John O Groats really has come to fame because it's really the most northerly point of mainland Britain that is inhabited essentially, other than by a lighthouse. So the route that connects Land's End to John O Groats has become an iconic route, the longest drive in Britain at 874 miles. So it's 700 miles north of London, and what makes it feel particularly remote to me is that it's a 6-hour drive north of Edinburgh. But we'll come back to the subject of remoteness because you and I, Kevin, have talked a bit about concepts of remoteness, and it's quite an interesting subject.
Yep. And for those who have not been to Caithness, I mean, it is in the highlands of Scotland, which people probably will heard of and will have an idea of, but Caithness is a wee bit kind of different, isn't it? What's the character like of the landscape?
Well, it is. It's in the Highlands, as you say, but different. It's actually a small green. The area of John O Groats which is shown in the aerial view coming up. It's actually a small green triangle, roughly from sort of Wick and Thurso down to Leibster, which is at the top corner of the flow country, and the flow country is a really fascinating part of Highland, which is actually the biggest peat bog, blanket bog in Europe, and covers 50% of Caithness and Sutherland, and it's a much flatter terrain, and as you're entering Caithness, you come over this brown, quite flat landscape, which you sort of skim over. And as you come down into Caithness, you come into this sort of greener landscape. And it's quite a magical experience, quite a way to arrive.
Yeah, it's slightly out of the way. So I'm just being told, Simon, that we have people watching from Norway, Louisiana and Munich.
Right.
Pretty good. So John O Groats, does it get many tourists from around the world?
John O Groats, yes. Caithness maybe has been less discovered, but the North Coast 500, which is this kind of, I suppose, modern version, a Scottish Route 66, if you like, which has increased tourism hugely in the area, and it's struggling to cope a bit maybe. But before the North Coast 500, John O Groats was still getting well over 100,000 visitors a year, and I would say a lot of them had just gone there to have gone to the most northerly point, or a lot of them do it to raise money for charity. But Caithness is definitely a belter of a place to go for a visit or for a holiday. And I mean, particularly south of Wick, we've got the Wholigo Steps, which are absolutely fantastic, and Old Castle of Wick, which is absolutely terrifying and very dangerous. It's looked after by us, and I believe it's actually open, and you can go and visit it. But do take notice of the signage that we provided, telling you to take care. So it's highly recommended as a thrilling place to go.
Well, glad to get that health and safety warning. The legal team will be glad, Simon. Before we move on to talking about the mill, I'm going to ask a question before someone else does. Who is John O Groats, and can I take him for a pint if I go on my holiday there?
Well, he's probably he's probably a little bit dusty now. It's actually John O Groats was actually supposedly named after a chap called Jan de Groot, but I'm not a historian of that sort. So when I first went to Caithness when I was a child, I loved the gift shop at John O Groats, and so my knowledge of the subject is really probably more likely to be from a tea towel on the subject. But Jan de Groot, he was a real person, and he was given the franchise for the ferry from Orkney to Caithness. Caithness to Orkney, around about 1500, and as you know, Shetland and Orkney were actually controlled by Norway until 1468, and then it was. I'm sorry, I have to be careful with my words. Probably won't get this right, but it was given to Scotland as part of a dowry for the marriage between the King of Norway's daughter and James III, and it's King James III, and Jan de Groot actually, the legend goes that he had 7 sons, and none of them could agree on who had priority in the household. So he had an 8-sided house that was on the site of the current hotel, and with an 8-sided table, so that nobody was sitting at the head of the table. So all that is 100% true according to a tea towel. However, Jan de Groot actually was a real person. He's buried in the church nearby, and the name Groat is actually one that you find in Caithness. But in fact, John O Groats was a village called Duncansby, and that's its real name. And Rogney, who worked at the mill, tells me that it was likely to be an enterprising postman who decided to promote tourism in the area by calling it John O Groats.
Well, that was all news to me, Simon, and the John O Groats Tourist Board thanks you for that. We'll move on now to talk about the mill. We've got a few questions coming in already, which we'll answer in the next minute or two. So, Simon, why don't you tell us about the building in particular you've chosen to talk about today, which is John O Groats Mill. So why are you talking about today, and what's important about it? Why is it special?
Well, I cover Scotland really from Stirling up to Shetland in my work dealing with listed buildings, and we were asked if there were any projects that stood out for us in our work in our areas for the forthcoming Doors Open Day idea, and John O Groats Mill really stands out to me. It's the last. It's known as being one of the last water mills built in Scotland, but actually, what's amazing about it is it's been operated by one family, the Houston family, since 1750 and ran up until 2001. And unfortunately, the miller, Magnus Houston, died suddenly, and that was the reason why the doors were locked, and it hasn't operated since. It's the only mill in Caithness that still has its machinery, and with a bit of work could operate again. It's built of local materials, the local flagstone, which gives that lovely aesthetic that you get only with buildings where the roof and the walls are built of the same stone. It still has 246 artifacts inside, ranging from oil cans to car parts to miller's tools and the like. And then it has this incredible intangible history, heritage of the stories that go with it. And certainly talking to Rogney, who's the chairman of the John O Groats Mill Trust, the stories are fantastic. And I believe a university did interview Mr. Houston before he died. But all of this actually gives something that's really exceptional in our line of work, which is authenticity. And this building and this project is authentic in every possible way. And I think working in heritage, that sometimes if you're doing a good job, authenticity is the hardest thing to hold on to. And this has absolute bags of it. So it's a great project.
And before we move on, I think, to the history, Simon, we've got questions pouring in. And on that note, we get a very difficult question, but maybe we can say something. Colin is asking what climate heritage issues are prevalent to this particular site, which is a very good question.
I don't know about that. I mean, sorry, climate heritage issues.
I'm assuming Colin is asking about climate change issues.
Yes, I don't know, in that it sits actually on next to a ravine, and it was supplied by a lathe that was came from two ponds, so which I can talk about later on. I mean, all buildings, we're definitely monitoring how traditional buildings are coping. And John O Groats Mill is an example of one that was built without gutters and downpipes. And that's something that I would say that we'd have to review when it comes to the restoration. It would be a shame to put gutters and downpipes on it, but we might find that it's necessary to protect the walls.
Yeah, and I think it's worth saying, we're maybe not the best people to answer that, but we do have a climate change team who do work on this and have published work on the impact of increased storminess, increased rainfall in historic buildings, which you would be able to find on our website. So we might be able to put the link up to that.
Yes, I mean, the mill, it developed from hundreds, if not thousands, of years of milling probably on that site and within those societies, and they milled at certain times of year when there was more water available, and the grain could be harvested when it was dry enough, and then ground when there was enough rain. And that's a very fine balance as to whether that's still the same.
So in a way, the kind of local climate would have really governed how it was used?
Very much so, yes. In fact, I asked Rogney to give me a description of how that worked. What time of year did they actually do milling? Which I could maybe read out if we have time.
Yeah. And whilst we're still on the tourist question, we might not know the answer to this, Simon, but Abby's asking about local museums in Caithness and John O Groats. Do you know? I've not been for years myself.
Yes.
But
I was going to say that the proposal is to turn this into a heritage attraction, but I think it's one that will complement the existing ones very well. So we've got the Castle Hill Heritage Centre really quite nearby to the west, which is essentially based on the Castle Hill pavement works where the flagstones come from. And then there's the Wick Heritage Centre. I don't think any of these are open now. And then there's the Strathneva Museum along at Betty Hill. And I think I think John O Groats Mill will sit very nicely alongside these.
Great. Well, there you are. That's an itinerary for your holidays, Abby.
Yes.
So can you just give us a little bit more information on how the building's kind of constructed, when it's from?
It's actually, sorry, I should have said it's a watermill, and that's not obvious from the photograph. So the photograph, that we just had, the watermill's tucked around to the left. And there probably was an earlier mill on the site, but the Houstons took over the tenancy of the mill in 1750. And I think in the 18th century, there were two mills sort of sitting parallel to the river. So the river is on the left down in a ravine. And then they were enlarged around 1818. And then at a really prosperous time, the mills were really quite substantially rebuilt around 1901. In 1901. So we'll come back to that.
Okay, grand. And finally, you mentioned it's listed. Is that your interest in the building?
Yes, it is listed actually. Yes, it's listed. Well, it was listed at Category B in 1984. So it's a very long time since anyone looked at that listing. So it would be interesting to see, what was made of it if it was reviewed, because mills with their surviving machinery are much rarer than they were back in 1984, and we actually. I think the way that we assess significance is more subtle and more sophisticated than it was back then. So I think it would be very interesting to see what a review made of the mill, but that would have to come from then. So I think I was going to ask you a question at this point, which is that I mentioned there was probably an earlier mill on the site, and I believe that grain has been exported from Caithness since the 14th century. And I wondered if you could give us a bit of background from your archaeological knowledge on the history and archaeology of mills in the Highlands and Northern Isles.
Yeah, I can give you a wee bit, Simon, just to give you some background. So obviously milling, grinding stuff up is a pretty early invention in human history and has been about for a long time. But to talk about more modern kind of Highland history, so say maybe in the 18th century, like when the mill first came into use, people would have used something called a rotary quern, which I think we have a nice archive drawing of. So it's a very ancient technology, but one of these things that still worked. So you see in a part of a print here from the 18th century, these two women using a rotary quern. So it's kind of two big flat stones basically sitting on top of each other. There's a hole in the middle where you pour the grain or whatever, and then there's another hole for a stick, which uses a handle, and you just turn it manually. So it's incredibly sort of hard, back-breaking work. You can see that two people are doing it at once here to sort of lighten the load. These were actually used for thousands of years and were certainly still in use in the 20th century. I wanted to get some photographs of people using them, and you actually can get photographs on Scran, which is a fantastic online photograph resource. However, all the photographs were of men using them, and I think they were all staged because my understanding is it was women who unfortunately had to do this backbreaking work almost all of the time. So I wouldn't necessarily trust those are photographs of them in action. But yes, it's a very, very simple technology, but it was a big part of everyday life, really. So I think women were probably spending some time every single day grinding grain for their family. You basically, as you grind it, it just comes out the sides, and you can see these women are actually catching it in their skirts. But you could also lay like a blanket down. But because they were used every day, they gained a kind of cultural significance. I don't know, Simon, in your travels around the countryside, you sometimes see millstones at the entrances to people's houses, don't you?
Yes.
By the roadside, partly because they're just attractive, nice big decorative stone. But as archaeologists, when we excavate buildings, you find often millstones built into the walls are really often in the entryway. Obviously, they're flat, so it's practical, but they probably symbolised kind of plenty because they're associated with obviously food and grain. So they're kind of culturally important.
Mm-hmm.
But as well as people using these kind of very old-fashioned methods, there was also something called a horizontal mill or a click mill, which you can really get all over the Highlands, but particularly associated with areas like Caithness and the Northern Isles.
And this image, I think you had an image of one, it's just coming up.
Yep, it's a particularly fine example, which is one I'm happy to say is in the care of HES, which you can visit. It's in mainland Orkney. It's called Dunby Click Mill. It's not open at the moment, sadly, but probably will be hopefully in spring 2021. So this is kind of, it's water driven. You can see, again, it's got the big millstones. It has a hopper where the corn goes. But rather than being a vertical mill wheel, which most people would be used to seeing, it's horizontal and it's a lot smaller. So it basically allows you to use a very small amount of water. You can set it up on any stream, really. And the water just drives the mill that goes round and spins the big stone. It's a much more simple design. It doesn't have all the gears and all that stuff. And these are known as click mills. Supposed to be because of the noise they make, click clack, when they were operating. But there is a kind of story that it's almost kind of criticising Gaelic speakers. So people used to say that Scots speakers would say that Gaelic speakers were click clacking when they were speaking, and because these were associated with the Highlands, it's thought to be maybe they were called click mills because it was about speaking Gaelic, but I'm almost certain that's not true because it's just too romantic. I suspect the simple answer is probably the correct one, as it usually is in these circumstances. But yeah, so around 1750, most people would be grinding their own grain, and there would be the odd place like the one you see there in that reconstruction drawing. But you might think, why would everyone not want to go into a horizontal mill, which is much less physical labour? But you need a miller to have a click mill, and millers were not trusted. So they take a fee, which traditionally in the Highlands was a 17th, and millers were seen as very unscrupulous and having their fingers on the scale and stealing your grain. And the name Miller in Scots or English, you'll know, obviously comes from millers, but the common Scottish name Macmillan is also the same. So it comes from Machiavellian, son of the mill. So if there's any Macmillans listening, I'm afraid you're untrustworthy. That's that. But yeah, so when, I guess, John O Groats Mill was built, it would have been quite different in the landscape. And I think it'd be great if you could now tell us about kind of, what the history of it is and when it was built.
Yes, okay, if we could get another picture of it, yes. So here's a picture coming up. It was actually two mills, and it sits just by a ravine, and so it's just out of sight. But I think there was a photograph, but sorry, yes. If we get the next photograph, actually, this is taken by Sophie Robertson, who's a local person, and I think it's a great picture because you can see the launder, which is the timber trough coming in at the bottom, and what that doesn't, what you can't see is that that's supplied by a pond, which is on the south side of the road. But the launder is popping up at the bottom of the picture there, and it's tipping over the first mill wheel, which is the little on the little gable and on the left, and then it runs to the right and then into a covered wheel pit, which is out of view. So the history of the mill, as I was saying, there's that early history, but it's been since 1750. It was tenanted by the Houston family, 6 generations up until it closed. But they actually managed to buy it in 1924. So it's quite an interesting story about changing fortunes in society that allowed them to expand, but also in the family that allowed them to buy the mill and improve it.
And before I ask a daft laddie question myself, Simon, just to remind everyone who's watching that if you have any questions, we'd love to hear them. Just use them, put them in the chat, or on YouTube if you have a Google account, you can add it. But my quite daft question is, what was actually ground in it?
Well, it's called a corn mill, and a corn mill actually means that it grinds grain, and so in fact, Rodney tells me that this only ground two grains, which was beer, spelt B-E-R-E, which is a sort of primitive form of barley, and oats. So they're fairly low yield crops. But John O Groats mill actually, it was a very posh mill, certainly after being rebuilt in 1901, and a mill of that size would have done all of the things from threshing the crop, which is running it through a machine to separate the grain from the straw, drying the grain in the kiln, which is the bit on the right, grinding it through the mill wheels, and then packing it and exporting it.
And on that note, Mark asks us, why are the mills in Caithness so big? It is a big old building.
Yes, well, we were talking about that both from a sort of historical context of thirlage, where a mill would be in the ownership of an estate, a country estate, and would serve all of the farms on that estate, and then the estate would make profit out of the flour which was exported from it. So that's my understanding about why they're so big. Of course, in the 19th century, we see this massive expansion of trade by sea, even though they've been trading across the North Sea and the Baltics for 1,000 years. We see a massive campaign of building purpose-built harbours and granaries to service this the sheer amount of grain coming in from Caithness and from areas like Murray.
Yeah, and I think that might surprise some of our listeners, because certainly most people think of the Highlands as being people living there very hand to mouth and very quite unproductive land. And some areas that's true, but from my own experience, there is actually some quite dramatic, almost industrial buildings in parts of the Eastern Highlands, isn't there? Especially in places like near Dornoch. So this definitely feeds into that. So although it might be surprising to see such a large building in the Highlands, maybe for the Eastern Highlands it's not quite so out of character.
Right. It feels very like a lowland sort of economy in the way that the farms have big green fields, so they're quite quite far apart, and then you have quite serious industrial enterprises like the flagstone quarries, fishing stations, and then these commercial harbours, which I've got some pictures of later on if we have time.
Yeah, well, but before we move on to anything, should we talk about how it actually works? How does it actually grind grain?
There's I actually can't answer that question because it would take far too long and it's far too complex. There is an element of it that John O Groats mill is fairly unique because when they rebuilt it in 1901, one of the Houstons, who was an engineer in Glasgow called Billy, he came up, and with the miller, they went round all of the mills in Caithness and kind of compiled all the best features of each. But at that period, of course, they were importing machinery from places like Manchester and things. So there is an element of individuality, but there is a picture, there is an amazing drawing done by our our survey team. This drawing is done by Heather Stoddart, and it just shows how complex the machinery was. That's a section through the building with the machinery. It gives an indication of it. It actually doesn't indicate how complex it really was, but the amount of time and effort it took to actually record it is an indication of that. So there are three mill wheels, and some of those I think had more than one process, or the processes were put through more than once. And our colleague Pauline Megson, she did a really a good piece of work for the Prince's Regeneration Trust in the form of a conservation statement. And her take on how does the mill work is, well, the best thing is to watch, have a demonstration, because it's too difficult to describe. But in a nutshell, the grain was brought in and hauled up to the top and stored for use, and then it was dried in the kiln, and then you can see the top loft is top floor, or the sack floor, and it was poured down a chute into the hoppers above the millstones, and then it came out of the sides of the millstones and the meal dropped into the bottom floor into sacks. That's kind of roughly, in a nutshell, what happens in most mills. But I think the thing that amazes me is that the whole process happens because they carved grooves into the millstones, which both crushed the grain and separated it. And I don't know, that this is obviously the technology of thousands of years of trial and error. And I just think it's absolutely extraordinary that it worked so well.
In a strange way, it's actually the same technology as the quern, except all the machinery is really just about turning it so you don't have to do it yourself. In some ways, it's a development of the same technology, isn't it?
Yes. So the mill was actually powered by an overshot mill wheel, and as you say, you get horizontal mills, click mills, and then you've got undershot, where it's just sticking out into a river. The mill wheel is sticking out into a river, and then there's the overshot, where it arrives on a wooden trough and it fills 3 or 4 buckets, and then it unbalances the wheel and it starts to turn. And that's, I believe, is the most efficient form of powering a mill, but you need the height, and they have the height at John O Groats because it sits next to this ravine.
And I think you were talking about the listing and how listing has changed, and I was thinking about, we don't just list buildings because of their specific architecture. A lot of it is about, do they tell us a story about the place these days, isn't it? So I wonder if we could take some time to think about the kind of, what story does John O Groats Mill tell us about, the Highlands, Caithness? And actually, Glenn has sent us in a good question that starts us off on this, I think. He's asking, was there usually just a single central mill in a region, or were there numerous small individual mills? And I think actually that process of change is quite interesting, isn't it? And John O Groats Mill has got a place in that.
Yes, yes. I'm not really qualified to answer that question. I don't think. I mean, certainly an expert.
If we think about so prior to large mills like John O Groats, and I was talking about, everyone would have had their own quern and done it themselves. Yes. So it's not at all centralised. And then actually, when the estates bring in mills, they almost have to kind of force people to use them, don't they?
Yes, that's right. I mean, it was for the profit of the estate, but I do see this term commercial mill sometimes applied to historic water mills, and I think those were mills built, in the second half of the 19th century, where the farmers would bring in the grain and have it made into meal, and then take it away again, and they would then sell it. So I think we got a similar sort of series of large mills from that, but the Caithness mills seem to be earlier than that.
And we mentioned it before, Simon, the term thurlage.
Yeah.
People probably not came across before. That basically means when your landlord forces you to use a mill, doesn't it?
It means that, yes, that's right, that all the farmers on the estate must use that mill to grind their corn, and then the profits from that exercise go to the estate. So I suppose it pays the rent of the farmer, but
there's actually an interesting social history about people resisting that. So people would actually be people would have their querns broken forcibly, sometimes by estates,
I
so that
see.
they couldn't grind their grain at home. So in the Western Isles, there's a loch called, apologies to Gaelic speakers, Loch Nambrianchen, which is the loch of the querns, because the estate basically came round and threw people's querns into the loch, so that they had to use the mills. So when Glenn's asking, was there usually a single central mill or lots, it's probably about change over time, isn't it? So you go from
Yes.
everyone grinding their own to everyone almost being forced.
Yeah.
And I think that story of social change in the Highlands is well reflected in Caithness, isn't it? With kind of industrial and planned towns. I think we've got a nice
Yeah.
image of one.
I think we saw a picture of the Houstons standing outside the mill, the previous one, which we were just going to talk about briefly. Sorry, just because it is a picture of changing fortunes, and that's. I think we estimate that was probably taken before the First World War. And the mill looks pretty clean. So it looks like it was sometime after it was rebuilt in 1901. There's a little bit of staining on the kiln vents. But I think they were still tenants at that point. But I think what interested us about that image was it was a sign of prosperity of a form. Unfortunately, the mill is actually slightly cut out on the left-hand side of that image. But you'll notice that the lady, you were interested in the fact that the lady had a safety bike as this very modern form of bicycle. And they're obviously displaying their embracing of modern technology in a very nice way. And I think we were interested in what that said about social change. But
yes, that's a good tip for anyone at home who's trying to date photograph. Bicycles are amazing because they change so fast. So we discovered that one was a step-through safety bicycle, which started in the late 1880s, and was for women to be able to mount the bicycle in a more decorous manner without having to stretch over a big post. So there's a good tip for anyone interested in historic photographs.
An interesting part of that was that I read that the machinery for the mill, when they rebuilt it in 1901, cost £300. And I would imagine, I don't know if the estate paid for that, but it may have been that the tenant paid for it. But at that time, I would imagine you could buy a nice Victorian villa in Wick for £300.
Oh, yeah, very much so. And actually, along that note, Simon, Sarah is asking, is there any parts of the mill still moving or working? She notes that the building that Perth and Kinross Heritage Trust now work from, which is a mill, had their wheel turning recently due to heavy weather.
Oh, really? Yes. That'll be the City Mills. Yes. I'm sure. As far as I know, I mean, they're fantastically dangerous places in their kind of natural form mills, in their historic form. With the City Mills has plenty of guards over the cogs and things. But I think with a bit of, as far as I know, with a bit of maintenance, it would all turn and work again. The first bit to go normally, I think, is the launder, which is is made of wood and carries water. So the main thing is to be able to get the water there, and then hopefully the water wheel. But the machinery inside, as far as I know, it's all in good condition. And it is rare when we do. There are only 2 or 3 other mills that are actually making flour, which is what they'd like to do there. I mean, there's Golspie Mill, which is well worth looking up and seeing what they're doing there. And then Barony Mill on Orkney and Blair Athol. I think that's it. I'm sorry, apologies if I've missed one. I have a feeling there's another one which I can't remember. But there are a small number, maybe 10 that have working machinery like New Abbey and Mill of Towie and Barry Mill, which have working machinery that still turns, and that. But the vast majority of them have had, a lot of the machinery was valuable as scrap, so it was removed quite early on, and many of them have been converted into houses.
I think, speaking of that, we should move on to what's happening at John O Groats Mill today, Simon. But just quickly, we've got a very specific question which we probably can't answer from Ross and Robin, who are asking about some of the Groat family connected to the Sinclairs, and is this connected to the Barragill estate? I think we would only say there's not a specific Groat connection to the mill, is there?
Not that I'm aware of, no.
But as you said, it's a common family name in the area, as is the Sinclairs, Castle Sinclairs up that way, isn't it?
Yeah.
They're a big and important family. So I think Ross and Robin will have to do their genealogical digging there to find that one out. Okay, so I think we'll move on now to the work you've been doing recently, Simon. So can you tell us what's happening there today?
Well, at the moment, the building is shut up and it is at risk, but a trust has been set up in order to save it and bring it back into use. And what they'd like to do is to turn it into a heritage attraction, which is really just the mill as it stands, restored. Maybe capable of making meal again, and then with education and social facilities as well. So that would probably mean putting an extension on it, so the trust came into being last year, I think, and they've been awarded 384,000 for the purchase of the mill and the land around it by the Scottish Land Fund, which is wonderful. They support good community-based projects and sorry, I've forgotten. Yes, it'll probably take about £1.5 to £2 million to do a sort of conservation job on the mill building and build the extension. So I've been working with Chris Bowes of McGregor Bowes Architects, and we were looking at the building, thinking where would be the best place for an extension. And originally we were looking at the front, putting a glass box that was lightweight and transparent and all that. But I thought this was a kind of interesting case. I mean, in historic buildings, we talk about their character with listed buildings and how altering them affects their character. And I thought this was a case actually where it sits right by the road and it's such a familiar building, and it's been unchanged since 1901. I thought this is almost like an old friend. And I think really that putting an extension on the front probably isn't a good idea. So the first principle we looked at, which is the next slide, was keeping the interior absolutely as it is and just doing a proper conservation job. If we could see the interior, it's the next slide.
I take it with being such a specific use, the building probably is not easy to adapt to any other use. Is that right?
No, it has this, amazing thing of these hundreds of artifacts within it. You can see some mill wheels sitting up against the wall on the left, and then those are the 3 mill wheels in their casings on the right.
Oh yes.
And all of these things have stories, and it's the stories associated with the mill that are the fascinating things. So I hope it'll be possible when circumstances change to visit the mill, and they might have another open day next year, hopefully, to show people around. So I think so we're thinking, right, what's the best way to secure the future of this mill? And the best way to secure what's really all of the best aspects of it is to add a modern extension on that leaves the mill absolutely as it is, but also gives modern facilities. So the next slide is of the back of the mill, which is much plainer, but no less beautiful for that. You can see, it gives you an idea now of how high it sits above the river, and next to that little Cromwellian bridge. And I think I can't see myself, but I think you can see the little covered lean-to that has the pitch wheel in it. So we thought the best place for an extension would be to try and tuck it into the corner. There's actually a door that you can't see where the building checks back in the middle there, and try and build something into the bank. So at the moment, the moment what we're looking at is something that's modern and very different, but very light touch in terms of its physical impact on the building. So if you could see the next slide. So this isn't a very sympathetic photograph, because it's a stone wall on that side, which will be the same color as the building, but actually it's got a green grass roof and a glass frontage to keep it as lightweight looking as possible. But it'll really be the view that the side or the place that really protects most of the most interesting views of the building, and it'll give modern facilities. And the other intervention, which we can't avoid really, is providing banking up to the kiln you see there on the left, to give access to everyone to the upper floors. It's the only way to do it.
Just to let people know, this is probably one of the last, probably only got a couple of minutes to go, so if you have any more questions to ask us, we'd love to hear them. One's just popped up. Glenn was asking, those wheels are huge, correct? Were they interchanged? It must have been incredibly hard work to do so.
Yes. There's actually a fantastic little statement on the stones in the conservation statement, which Pauline wrote, but I'm not sure we have time to read it. But they're actually made of different sorts of stone for the different functions, and anyway, I'm not sure. They are enormous, and they actually turned remarkably quickly. I don't know about here, but I know another mill at another mill, they were saying they turned at 80 revolutions per minute, which seems extraordinary to me, but I'm not sure if that can be true. It's so it's a lot of weight whizzing around at quite a rate.
Yes, it's certainly quite an impressive piece of technology, I guess.
About 10 times faster than the wheel itself. Yeah.
It's great, obviously, to hear what's happening with the mill today. Would you have said that the building was at risk until recently?
I think it's at risk until we find out whether the funding will be available, and that's what the trust's job is to do, is to get the funding together. And hopefully they'll set up, a fundraising. They will be setting up a fundraising thing, but it's at risk in some ways. You could say that a building is at risk until somebody buys it and turns it into a house. But in this case, there's so much at risk in terms of the fragility of what survives there and how untouched it is. And so hopefully this is a project that will actually save all of that and make it available for people to enjoy. And whilst the extension at the back, it is an intervention, I think that old friend by the road will still survive, as a familiar thing that people will love.
That's good. And Jenny is desperate to go and visit it. She's asking the $1 million question, really. Is there a time scale for the restoration?
No, I think I know that the Mill Trust had lots of really good help from the Architectural Heritage Fund, who advise on putting together projects and fund them as well. So fund the project applications. So yes, they've got a long way to go in raising funds. They do have a Facebook page though, so I hope you'll look them up on Facebook and keep in touch with what they're doing there.
Yes, and I think, in fact, things are moving so quickly. I think they only got the keys or got the money to buy it very recently, didn't they, just in the past few weeks?
maybe.
If you followed their Facebook, I saw a picture of them.
But that may have been the award, actually. Sorry. Yes.
Yes, that's it. I saw a picture of them looking very proud, standing next to the building, holding a piece of paper that looked very important. So,
yes.
So it's very much a story that's really just started. As you say, there's a long way to go.
Yes, a long way to go. But I mean, I think it's absolutely the sort of project that all these bodies like the Scottish Land Fund and Scottish Government, love. There's lots to love about it. So I hope all the figures stack up, and the business plan and all that sort of thing, if that's what's required.
On that happy note, Simon, I think about our old friend by the road. Hopefully, that's been enough to make everyone go to the Trust website, have a look to see what's happening, and hopefully get us all up to Caithness in different times when we can get out and explore. I look forward to doing that myself. So thanks very much for everyone's questions. It's been great to get them. If there's any more, I'm sure we can answer them on the YouTube and Facebook. This video will be going up on YouTube, on HES's YouTube quite soon, so plenty more time to read and digest and give us any more questions. So thanks again for joining us this afternoon, and I hope you've enjoyed it.